As we're going, I want to do that while I'm talking. I want you to be sitting and listening to Savannah when she starts. So thank you for joining us. I know that there are some people online as well. Oh wait, where's Joe? Should we wait for Joe? Nah, I think we'll still get started. Okay, so we're really happy to have this opportunity to give a snapshot of where peace engineering at Drexel is right now. And I know some of you here are listening were really part of the early conversations of how we were growing it here at Drexel. So we just want to be able to show you where we've come and how it's grown since then and who we're networking and working with now. So many of you know that peace engineering at Drexel was an intentional integration of peace building and engineering. And this is what happened when Joe Hughes and Sheldon Himmelfarb, who's president of the Peace Tech Lab, started thinking about the ways in which engineering could better improve society with peace building skills and how peace building could be advanced with engineering and applied sciences. And when we started thinking about this, there was no such peace engineering label. There were no degree programs. There was humanitarian engineering and development engineering and some engineering programs that were looking at social justice and activism and human rights engineering and data, but there were no degrees in peace engineering. There was a woman at University of St. Thomas who was having engineering students, this is Camille George, take classes from their peace and social justice school, but there did not exist any peace engineering degrees. So what we have built in the last little while is the first degree in peace engineering, and we have with us the very first graduate. So since then, things have grown. So there are lots of different programs that are adopting peace engineering programs of their own. There are PhDs in peace engineering that are coming out of George Mason and their School for Conflict Analysis and Resolution. There is a minor at University of New Mexico. And we have all sorts of engineering academic partners who are thinking about what peace engineering would look like on their own campuses. These are all people that we're working with. And so one person I want to introduce, so as we were transitioning to this 30,000 feet view of what engineering and peace building, that integration looks like, when it came time to actually build a program, what does this look like? What do engineers have to learn? What are some of the things that we have to think about? Jerry McCann, who is sitting right here and it represents Build Up, he really helped us understand in very concrete ways what engineering looks like through a peace building lens, through years of case studies and experience, and really helping us answer and ask the right questions. And he really does continue to do so. And so we had a really good day yesterday where, along with Jerry and a partner from the Peace Tech Lab, we started mapping out peace engineering areas of research and practice and education now that we're part of. It's grown, and there's so many different partners and networks that we're building. It's really exciting to think about where we're going now. So again, we have the master's degree, and we have our first graduate who you'll hear from soon. We're really also thinking about how does research look differently? So how do we advance research in a different way? How do we pivot engineering practice so that it's more conflict sensitive? So it thinks about the impact of engineering in society and in these contextually complex situations. So how do we build an understanding of both the technical and the contextual knowledge? And how do we translate that into research and practice? What does it look like when university research is participatory and when it's partnered with practitioners, with humanitarian organizations or NGOs that are working in the field? What does that look like? We're starting to test that out now, and we're going to give you some examples of some of our early projects in there. What does it look like if we're going to pivot engineering practice? National labs, priorities, what does it mean with all of those start looking at peace engineering? And so those are the kinds of things that we're looking at and working on. And we do realize also that if we're promoting this, if we're asking for shifts in how we do research fundamentally and how we practice in engineering industry, people are going to be looking to us for some of these indicators of peace engineering. How do we measure the impact of engineering design on society? How do we know if what we're doing has a positive impact, and on whom, and what that means for the context in which it's built? So those are the kinds of things that we are looking at. We're acknowledging that there's, while there weren't the academic programs when we started, and that's growing, there is often to academia, but highly active, this invisible layer of people who are working on the ground. So engineers who are working in really extremely complex situations, and we collaborate with these people. You see this in Colombia, you see this in Syria, you see this in Afghanistan, all over the world. So how do we try to take that knowledge, that contextual knowledge, merge it with the technical, as people are already doing, and bring that up into academia and research and learn from that? So that's what we're trying to do. So what we want to do today is I want to turn this over to Savannah, who is the first graduate peace engineering master's student in the world. And I thought no better person, yes. So no better person to describe our program than the first person who went through it. And really, for those of you who know Savannah, you could pick no better spokesperson and thought leader for someone to develop a program in academic disciplines. So I will turn this over to Savannah now, and she will give her experiences going through the program, and then we'll shift a little bit, and Joe and I will talk about some of our ongoing and sort of nascent research projects and how we're thinking about approaching research differently with this technical and contextual knowledge. So I will switch over to you. Oh, I have to say one thing. For the people online, we are going to briefly pause you. And this is out of respect. So we're going to pause you when Savannah starts talking about her experience working this summer in, with an organization that provides water and sanitation services in a refugee camp. And as many of you know, the trust necessary for an NGO to work in a context like that, and the trust they've built with the Greek government, is not something that we want to undermine by posting pictures. So we'll just pause you a little bit and then bring you back in when she's done with that part.
So thank you, Mira. No pressure now as the first one after all of those really nice words. But yes, I'm just here to share my experience. So this is just a little very broadly what I want to talk about. So how I define peace engineering, and a lot of that has come from conversations with Mira, James, Joe, Jerry, people who have been kind of in the field. A little bit about my background, what my experience has been in the peace engineering program, and then some examples of the work that I've been doing. So I think one definition of peace engineering is the application of science, engineering, and technology to promote and support peace. And so in an article about Mira and James, they defined it as the goals of the field are to prevent, mitigate, and recover from violence, and to develop sustainable social and technological systems for community well-being. And I really like this definition because it kind of sets up two things. One, that peace engineering can work across different contexts. So it's not just thinking about what are the most extreme conflict environments, but thinking about we can be involved in preventing, we can be involved in mitigating, and we can be involved in recovery. And it also sets up the relationship between these social systems and the technical or the technological systems. And I think as engineering, it's starting to become more apparent in all engineering disciplines, but you really have to understand the relationship between the social and the technical to be effective and ethical. And so I think sometimes the word peace sounds really lofty and unattainable. It's this thing for only starry-eyed hippies, but really peace does not mean the absence of conflict, but rather constructive management of conflict. And so that's a really important definition in that conflict is, it's just going to happen. It's a part of life. And there are tools to enable us to not delve into violence, but kind of manage that. We're social creatures. Conflict is a social process. So some people in the room might be familiar with this or online. This is developed by the United States Institute of Peace. It's called the conflict curve. And we don't need to really understand it too in depth, but just know that it's kind of this cycle of conflict, and those of us that use it also criticize it. Conflict obviously does not happen linearly, but there are different stages, right? So there's in the more preventative part where you might think of sustainable development, and then you have obviously as tensions rise, violence increases, all the way up to extreme cases like war scenarios, and then post-conflict peace building. And so again, highlighting that peace engineering can play a role in all sorts of these things. So whether it's community development in Philadelphia, there are going to be conflict drivers, or if you're in Syria, or if you're in a lot of Latin and South America where you've been recovering from conflict. And those are really lofty, broad examples, but conflict is often really localized. And so even if you're thinking about a country in which there's an active conflict going on, they might be at any one of these stages within that. So really highlighting that context is important. And so peace engineering is really broad, and it's inclusive of many different disciplines. So much of my experience has been in civil and environmental. That's what my background is kind of in. But we're seeing more and more linkages, and it's really important for more and more types of engineers to be thinking about this. Just like communities aren't monolithic, the engineering community is also not. And like I just said, it's contextual. So whether you're in a traditional engineering workplace environment, whether it's a community, whether it's a country, there are different levels of conflict analyses that you can do at all of these levels. It's also strategic. So just like engineering, peace and conflict practitioners have their own tool set. And this is really important to utilize. I think a lot of the times in engineering we hear about development failures in which an international NGO goes in and builds a well and it's not used. And it could not be used for a variety of contextual reasons. But really the development and peace building practitioners have tools that we can better utilize to have prevented that in the first place. And that helps us allocate resources better, right? Like we don't want to be doing work that's not effective, not only for our own time and resources or whatever our company is, but also for ethical and competence reasons. So we're making sure that we're not doing harm to a community. It's also analytical, so similar to strategic. There are processes that can be applied, or this is one way, like Mira just talked about, developing things like indicators, where engineers can really play a role in that, in thinking about how does the peace building community already do that? How do we better translate this to engineers who want to get involved in this kind of work? And that way it brings the lofty goal of peace back down to the really practical side of it, which it can be. And kind of like Mira mentioned, it's new, but it's also not so new, right? I'm the first ever academically titled graduate of the Peace Engineering program, but there are people that have been doing this work for like many and many years. And so I think the program is really exciting because in many ways it's forging a new discipline and it's creating an avenue in which students can be trained to do this. And I personally feel like that's really helpful because otherwise sometimes we don't know the mistakes until we make them. And when you're working with communities, that can have really devastating impacts on them. So finding a way where we can train the new and next generation of ethical and competent engineers is really where I see the program going. So, and it's only one piece of the puzzle. So engineers, we like to go into a situation and we like to solve problems, right? If you ask any engineer why they got into engineering, a lot of them will say they like to solve problems. And that's great. We love to solve problems. We obviously want to solve all the conflict. We want the world to be peaceful. But engineers can really only play one piece of that puzzle. And so it's about being humble and recognizing this. And so one quote that I love from Professor Joe Hughes is that engineers have always been involved, but it's often on-the-job training. You have to understand how engineering participates in stabilization, reconstruction, community development, and peace building. You have to understand the language and the problems. You have to be formally trained to work in the community, and that's what we're responding to. So I think that lays out why the program exists and some of the goals it has really well. And so I just want to take a few minutes and talk about my journey in getting here. So I actually started at Drexel as a biology major. I think that I always wanted to kind of help people, and with my background and in my high school classes, I was just kind of pushed towards biology. Like, what's a more direct application to helping people than the medical field? Especially because that's what I could relate to at that time. You know, I'd been around sick people. It's just like the most obvious kind of trajectory. And literally in my first term, I switched to biomedical engineering, kind of realizing I wanted to be more problem-solving, hands-on, and practical. And then in my first 2 years, it wasn't quite fitting on me, right? I did my first co-op in biomedical engineering, and so I was kind of taking advantage of these other opportunities that came my way. So I spent 2 months doing outdoor field work in Costa Rica, working with wildlife, and that had nothing to do with biomedical engineering, but it was really important for me to develop my understanding that I really had a passion for the environment and that that's something that I wanted to continue working with. And then in my second year, I participated in an alternative spring break, and this was right after coming off of my biomedical engineering co-op where I was like, I don't think that's what I want to do for the rest of my life. I participated in this alternative spring break in which I traveled to Haiti, and the team was mostly focused on cross-cultural learning and English language learning. But what I really got out of it was actually meeting people who were doing international development work there. And that was kind of my first exposure to the field. Before that, I had known that it was kind of a thing, but didn't really pay much attention to it. And this was like meeting people who had been working in international development for years, sometimes more successful than others, sometimes more ethically than others. And then that's kind of when I put all my passions together, especially being in a country like Haiti, where they've lots of deforestation, lots of environmental issues, natural disasters, kind of that whole gamut of just my passion for wanting to help people and the environment kind of came together. So almost immediately after I got back, I ended up switching into the custom design program here at Drexel, which is a really unique program in that it lets you create your own major. So I still wanted that like practical problem solving, but knew that I was more drawn to civil and environmental engineering rather than biomed. And then I also knew that I wanted to still do things to improve the human condition, so I was drawn to public health. And then I also knew that there were challenges with working across communities, even here at Drexel, engineers versus humanities. Every single time where you're working across communities, communication can be a challenge. So I also added global studies to that. So my undergraduate major was a combination of civil and environmental engineering, public health, and global studies, to kind of give me that balanced technical skills and the problem solving, but also doing so with this broader lens. And so this was actually things that I created for part of the custom design program as soon as I was accepted, really. And so I love that it's still really reflective of my journey and my experiences today. So I think often as engineers, we identify a need, right? Sometimes we identify it with the community, sometimes we don't. But once we have that need, we make certain assumptions about what is impacting that need. And I like to really broaden that and look at things holistically and look at all the different factors that could be affecting that. So whether it's social, political, environmental, cultural, economic, there's loads of different angles that we could come at it from, and it's really important that all of these are included, because not including one could lead to a vastly different design, impacting the community differently. Some buzzwords that I had included was life cycle sustainability and creative problem solving, which are still really true today. But I also really like that I included these words like community-based, cultural competency, and capacity building. So it's not just about an international person going into a certain environment, but it's really about working with the community from the ground up, understanding that we don't have the expertise in the room. Yeah, and then this, so often when we think of sustainable development, we think of the 3 Ps, so people, planet, and profit. And I really like this UN graphic that kind of expanded that, because those things are still true, but also it's always done in partnership, which is something that we highlight a lot of the times in the peace building world, is partnerships are the key to doing everything. You need trust. It's a long-term process between people. And then peace, kind of foreshadowing my way into the peace engineering program. So I kind of never thought that I would actually go straight from my undergrad to my master's, but the peace engineering program was the perfect balance that I was already kind of doing and looking for in my future, of balancing the technical with the contextual. Yeah. And my focus has kind of always been on things related to fundamental resources like food, water, shelter, electricity, stuff like that. So there are way better experts to talk about the actual program in the room. But kind of high level, the program was developed in collaboration with the Peace Tech Lab at the United States Institute of Peace, and engineers kind of working with this international development mindset, so like Mira had explained. And so I like to think of it kind of divided into thirds. So about a third of peace building and conflict management skills, which are mostly entirely new to engineers who are taking the classes. About a third of general engineering, things like research methods, data analysis, risk assessment, and systems analysis. And then about a third of whatever your technical focus and social dimensions are. And so this is really the area where people are allowed to choose what their focus is based on their own interests and goals. So this is, according to the website, all the different technical focuses that you can do. And I imagine that as the program gets bigger, there might be more added. So whether you're interested in software development, data mining, energy, me personally, with my background, I was interested in water, sanitation, and hygiene. Again, emphasizing that I like to think about holistically, so sometimes when I describe it, I talk about it more in terms of environmental security, thinking about the interlinkages between resources. And then your social dimensions are also kind of where you can personalize depending on what you like. So I did a lot more public health classes, because that's where my background was, but there's classes in policy, education, all sorts of stuff. And then you also have to complete an experiential learning, and this is where I'm going to ask that you pause the video for online. Yeah, thank you. for co-op was with a general contracting firm up in Boston, but it was a lot of managing different stakeholder priorities, so between the subcontractors, between the architects, and between the engineers. And they like it a lot more if you can say, like, I have experience, I know the engineering constraints, I know the constraints of being a subcontractor, and kind of relate to people on a human level first. And so I think that was a really important kind of skill. It's an important skill for most engineers to know, to learn how to communicate better across different groups. And I really liked the organization I was with because they understood the benefits of a system approach. So no, you can't just do WASH without thinking about how that WASH infrastructure is going to impact shelters, and you have to balance the social and the technical. And then for me, a big thing was that there's almost no sustainability in these systems being designed, and then there's no resilience. So when shocks happen, when all of a sudden 500 people arrive in one day, the system cannot recover from that. And then also it's just so important to be aware of unintended consequences and basic humanitarian principles like do no harm. And so for me, this highlighted kind of the humanitarian development peace-building nexus, which is something that I'm really, thank you. So highlighting the humanitarian development peace-building nexus. So humanitarian assistance might be provisioning shelter, water, food to limited, sometimes more permanent than others, like refugee camps tend to fall into the humanitarian assistance box. Moving towards development, so looking at some of those processes, like how do you provide for education, social institutions, and sustainability. And then finally moving into this prevention of negative conflict. And so just to talk very briefly about some of the other stuff that I've worked on so I'm looking at energy in the conflict curve and what current practices are to try and move towards better practices. So I think a lot of the times we see development, humanitarian, and then peace building, and sometimes it can be quite separated between the groups. If sustainable development practitioners were thinking about conflict sensitivity, then we probably would have never seen that fail well designed to begin with. So thinking about the tools that each different group is using and how to bridge those, and how do we think less about the conflict curve as buckets and more as a continuum in which every bucket can help the others. And so looking at energy, if we have in sustainable development practices, we are working under a longer time frame, we have more resources potentially, it's a more secure area, but that fragile and conflict-affected communities also need energy provision. So how do we do that? And understanding that sometimes the best fit is not actually the best practice. So us as engineers who want to make the most perfect technical system, sometimes it's not actually what the community needs at the time. I think that's all. And then looking at, again, just what drives conflict. So thinking about energy in terms of the three P's. So making sure that as an engineering group, if we are designing an energy system that's going to be in the hands of the wealthy elite, maybe that might not be so good. Thinking about long-term pollution and land degradation, because that can be a huge conflict driver. Looking at, is price going to fluctuate? Because that's another conflict driver. So kind of thinking about all these things. And just because a system has some of these things doesn't mean it's going to lead to negative conflict, but being aware of the institutional context in which you're working as well. And then this is a framework for what environmental peace building might look like. I did not come up with the categories, and Drexel did, but I really like it because it emphasizes that technical is necessary. So in terms of looking at energy as a form of environmental peace building, you can provide energy and mitigate energy poverty. But is that gonna impact the conflict cycle at all? And so we need to move not only from the technical, but to the restorative. So thinking about dialogue between groups, same thing with the bidet hoses, how you just need to start having conversations across groups, perceptions change, and transformation. And then eventually moving into the sustainable environmental. So not only are you dealing with energy poverty, but you're dealing with the root causes of conflict and looking at energy security and equity. And then some of the other work that I think Joe or Mira will talk about more later is the civilian harm project that we're working with, but in partnership with organizations that are already doing the work, thinking about the urban environment specifically and how that impacts civilian protection, thinking about what methods organizations are already using, understanding their methodology in data analysis, how they're using technology, and kind of thinking of ways forward. And then also using a systems approach. So civilian harm is really hard to quantify for a lot of reasons, but not only thinking about, okay, a bomb was dropped and people were killed immediately, because that's important to measure, but also if that impacted basic services, how does that impact overall health and well-being, stuff like that. And again, they're going to talk about this a little bit more, but things like water management and restoration, illegal deforestation monitoring and tracking, technology for good, looking at things like election violence, transboundary water modeling to improve peace agreements, gun violence. And again, how do you think it can be applied, right? It's a very new field, and a lot of my background is my background, and that's the stuff that I'm going to be working on, but really everyone can think about peace engineering in their own engineering work. And then people always ask, like, who would I work for? And I do think that this field is not only so relevant to the world that we see today, but there's a lot of interest in it. Part of me being a graduate student, being able to talk to you guys about it. Yeah, I've gotten so much positive feedback from people. Yeah, and I just think that the world is just starting to open up in terms of it, and there are tons of different organizations, whether it's a traditional engineering firm, like everyone contributes to peace in different ways, and so it's really thinking about how can you be a better engineer first, and then if you're interested in working in contexts that might be new to engineers, like refugee camps, like conflict, like peace building, yeah, you can also do that, but yeah, so that's what I have. Do you want to do questions?
And we want to leave some time for comments and questions for Savannah. So.
Sorry, I just talked for her. Yeah.
I hope you didn't answer this, I missed it. But how did you get involved with the NGO increase, and what, like, did you have to jump through hoops? Were there restrictions? I mean, how was that process?
Yeah. So I did mention this, but very briefly. So Mira went with University of Colorado's Engineering for Sustainable Development program, and they did an original technical assessment of the camp. And then she came back and was like, oh, you're looking for experiential learning, so that's how I got involved. When I was there were also students from University of Colorado who went, and so it was a nice continuation of their original assessment and kind of building those long-term partnerships. But yeah, I think sometimes, because I definitely felt before I went like, oh, I should be doing something, right? Like I have these engineering skills. Can I be doing a design beforehand and like be going in? And really, I went in to be a member of the team and just show up every day and do the things that were needed. I also saw people who did different things and showed up every day and did the things, but tried to allocate some of their time to implementing projects. And it's just a really hard context to work in. Our NGO was able to work there through relationship building. He showed up one day, was working with another NGO, kind of was involved in the camp, and eventually was like, you know, I have some technical experience, guys. Can I do some stuff? And it was really small. At first, you do really small projects, kind of showing that you are committed, you're going to continue showing up, and then eventually led to a lot of trust where now we're able to do those bigger projects, which was just out of the question when we first started. Yeah?
I think that helps me understand a little bit more about the background for this question, but is there a vision for training the people in the camp to do the maintenance level work that you were talking about and giving them some purpose?
So that's a really interesting question to ask. So a lot of NGOs in the camp work with camp residents. But a lot of camp residents have technical experience. They come from being trained as engineers, masons, whatever. Like there were many times when we'd be doing something and somebody would come and be like, you know, you're doing that wrong. You know, I can do this better, right? And so that was like a great way and easy to start conversations around. But as an international volunteer, we were not living in the camp. We were able to leave every day and go home to a clean shower where we were able to be clean, and residents are not able to do that. And so working with sewage and stuff like that, it's just not really ethical to ask them to be, exposing themselves to potential diseases and stuff like that when they don't have the same opportunity to,
In other sectors, they will be brought into things and do things, but this
and it's also, giving a purpose is really nice, but also making sure that we're not just taking advantage of the situation that they're in. So a lot of other NGOs who use who work with camp residents will provide financial compensation, which is a really great way for them to try and get work and stuff like that. But it's an NGO constraint as well, because a lot of international people are able to go as volunteers. You don't have to pay them. Yeah, so it's just another constraint on the organization and stuff too. Yeah. Yeah.
My understanding, like in general, a lot of engineering education focuses on kind of known inputs and then being able to guarantee known outputs for the engineering work that you have. Where you want to make sure a bridge supports a certain weight. You want to make sure that a software system supports a certain throughput. But it seems like the conditions that peace engineering occurs in are often difficult to understand all the qualities of the inputs that we're working with. It's highly improvisational. It's highly site-specific. And did you, like, from your own experience, do you have any conclusions about how we could, like, talk to engineers or, like, frame engineering differently in a way that supports this kind of, like, make, like, a more informal and more, like, a system that maybe has, like, focuses less on long-term guarantees and focuses more on, like, immediate deliverables for human needs?
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's definitely one of the biggest issues as engineers. We like to have assurances about things. And in this work, it's just not always like that. You might do something and then realize it's wrong, and hopefully you didn't do harm while doing that. But yeah, I think it's a really good question, especially because some engineers are more open to this than others. And so it's like the whole thing with science and community-based participatory research is that gonna, what's the words I'm looking for? Like making sure that what you're doing is robust and unbiased and all of that kind of stuff, which I think is a similar constraint, but I think it involves being not, like teaching us to be creative, and I think a lot of time engineering education is not that. We come in because we want to solve problems and we observe all these problems in the world, but then we're actually not taught to design solutions for those. We're taught based on like a box, put everything, only work with the things in the box, and you don't make assumptions about the things that you don't have to think about. So I think it starts with asking us to understand our own assumptions, allowing students to broaden the box, and actually encouraging discussions around broadening that. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
You know, that's really eye-opening. Great presentation.
Thank you.
When I hear about that, I didn't realize how bad the situation was. And
Yeah.
Think about you being over on that island and just things getting worse with more people coming over. Were there any positives, like other than the fact that you felt good about volunteering your time? Did you see anything like the community starting to come together, try to solve common problems, and try to create better living conditions?
Yeah. It's hard because I think a lot of times in community development, you're working with a stationary community. So Philadelphia is pretty stationary. People move, but for the most part, there's way less transience. So that's something that I don't think that is in a lot of literature yet about how to actually design with transient populations, especially when they don't want to be there, right? Like they are trying to get their application processed as soon as they can so they can actually leave the island and go to other places. I think some of it comes down to information sharing. So sometimes they don't understand the realities of what the process will look like until they get there, and then they're experiencing it, and then they're like, I'm going to be here for 2 years. And so starting to make some of those linkages. And I think a lot of it comes back to, like, I think that would be a really great empowering way to do that, because it can feel very dehumanizing to be stuck somewhere and not having control over your living situation for so long. But yeah, it's a question that is out there. And I think it's really constrained because so many organizations that are doing this kind of work are stuck in the things are happening and you have to respond right away. And I think that that's really the way that academics can be involved, is like understanding being there and understanding the situation, and then being able to come back and take that longer view mindset that academia allows us to do, while also supporting the organizations while they're still working. Yeah, and I don't think there's a perfect solution for that, but
was there any like activities for the refugees?
Oh yeah, so there are tons of organizations working in that kind of sphere. That just wasn't the technical side that we were doing, but yeah, tons of different organizations like that, trying to encourage community building, spaces where people can just hang out and be people, whether that's a classroom, whether that's like a gym setup, whether that's language learning or sports. Like sports are really big, teaching yoga, teaching skateboarding, like there's, those kinds of things are also existing, which I think is one of the reasons why it doesn't get worse than it is. Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you, Savannah.
Thank
It's
you.
wonderful for that experience. I was just wondering, and comparing the background that you brought to that issue and the other volunteers and even the management of the NGO, how do you compare how you looked at things? Were there others that had your perspective in terms of your technical lens, or was that something that was unique?
It's actually a really great question because the engineers that showed up we were the least useful people, to be honest, with this organization. If you had trade skills, if you were like a qualified plumber, electrician, whatever, show up, please, because we don't have to train you how to do it. So in some ways, engineers are actually not the right people to be going because we don't learn that stuff sometimes. So there's a lot of learning skills that I had not been asked to do in my education, whether it be welding, concreting, whatever. So the other engineers that worked with the organization, we all kind of learned on the ground. Some of us had like a little bit of previous construction experience. But yeah, I think, my background might have been, also we had people who didn't come from engineering or technical, so my background wasn't totally unique. We had other people who had done work in like the public health sector and gotten involved. Again, the trade stuff was kind of all on the ground training. And then the people in charge too, a lot of this response was from people with good hearts and good intentions, but didn't necessarily have training. So a lot of it was on the ground training, even in terms of what are the humanitarian principles? What does do no harm look like? That was context that the people who started the organization had gotten basically from on the ground training, online training, sometimes organizations would come. So a lot of it was like ad hoc. Whatever your background was, if you showed up with like an ability to learn and understand that you are one part of a team and that you didn't have all the answers, because I think also when I first got there, I was like, all of these solutions. And then you talk to people who are working with the organization and they'd be like, yeah, we did that like last year. Or like, yeah, we've thought about that, but this is why it didn't work. And so rather than like going like immediately spiraling and being like, oh, I can do this, like really having conversations with the people who had been there, including residents. Yeah, that was a long, confusing answer, but.
No, but I just wondered, because you were saying that as academics, we have the advantage of coming back and thinking about, and I'm just wondering if it's actually about being an academic or if it's actually about being an engineer.
Yeah.
I mean, certainly in my experience, if I was in that situation for years, typically the way that I would start to get to the kinds of solutions with the engagement of the people would touch on some of the things that you were already observing.
Yeah.
And that it's not just about the technical solutions and capacities to do that, but it's some of the longer term process thinking that engineers tend to have an ability to do that others may not.
Yeah, I definitely don't think it just has to be an academic thing. I think that's just because we're in an academic setting talking about it from an academic point of view. And that's where my specific interests lie in bridging that. But yeah, I think like most actors can be a really good asset, and definitely being able to break down complex problems, like making the complex practical and digestible is a really important like asset to bring to those situations. Yeah, thank you.
I have a variant on the same question.
Yeah.
What is the best role of a peace engineering graduate in addressing the problems that brought you into the field? Where do you fit in best?
Yeah, I think it depends on the question that you're asking. Sometimes the engineer does not have the best solution. Sometimes it's just about, for me, I think that I care about a lot of different issues. And so I hope that I can be present in some of these situations and then kind of retroactively figure out, well, like, can my engineering skills be useful? But kind of showing up as a person first, not my discipline first. I think right now I also really like on the ground field work, and so that's what I want to do for a little bit longer. But I definitely do see the role that like academia can play. And so hopefully eventually being able to bring back like good contextual experience in, whatever I end up doing. But yeah, big questions.
Yeah, we're all trying to figure that out. I'll invite you here to think that through with us. We'll get there.
Yeah. Yeah, so it's actually an interesting, when I first applied to the custom design program, I actually in my vision statement kind of had this idea that maybe I would found my own organization one day, because I am really interested in holistic problem solving, whether it's the engineering problem, whether it's the conflict curve, really thinking about like long-term impact and relationship building. And there's not many organizations that I found that do, they're probably out there, I just don't know about you, sorry, but that do this thinking about resources holistically and thinking about that holistically. So either you're applying for a job specifically in the wash sector, or you're applying for a job specifically in the energy sector, and I'm really interested in like how these things intersect. I think also my background, I might be in a good position to be a facilitator among different groups. So thinking about how to get engineers to show up and get them to understand that they're one piece of the puzzle, while also being able to relate to like the peace building field or the development field, and get all sorts of actors kind of in the same room in partnership with the community, and really create like this long-term capacity building type role. I don't know, 10 years, 20 years, that's a big timeline for me to be thinking in right now. But yeah, I definitely have hopes to do big things with this. And yeah, really bringing different actors together, I think, is so critical, and it doesn't have to be me, and there are other organizations. And I think that that's one thing that we can learn from the peace building community, is that they already see the value in that. And so if you're an engineer who's trying to do certain types of work, being able to partner with those people who have already been on the ground doing that stuff, like that's actually what you need. You don't, yeah. Yeah, okay.
Based on the time that you got to spend with these refugees,
Yeah.
Over the period of the summer, would you say that there's a new like perspective or insight that you gained that perhaps the average person hearing about it on TV or their phone, like wouldn't necessarily get to pick up about like their situation and like what their
Yeah.
might be?
I think that's with anything. If you care about something, you're gonna like put more time into actually thinking about it. There are definitely things that aren't on my radar yet, and so when a news thing comes up about it, I don't click on it to read it. Yeah, and I think that there is real knowledge that comes with just being on the ground. And so I talked about those levels of conflict, and one of my experiences was that I didn't understand that when I got there. I got there and I kind of slowly was developing the understanding of the context. And really, I think like we can talk about, that was probably reflective of how I was talking about it too. When I first got there, I probably had a much more narrow mind of what the actual conflict was looking like, and the relationships between those. And then, you know, it took me a full month to really like start to understand and feel comfortable, and like I know who to ask what questions to, especially when it's such a patchworky kind of response with tons of different organizations doing tons of different things, all understanding the situation slightly different. So also my experience, I understand less things about the legal process than I would have if I was working with a legal organization. But yeah, definitely like you have to be on the ground sometimes to actually understand. And that's also especially important why it's important for academics and engineers who might not have the resources to go for long periods of time to work with people who understand. If you even think that you don't understand, then like find somebody who does. Yeah, I think that was probably one of my biggest takeaways. Yeah. Yeah.
I'm curious if you see this being something that could also partner with other more specific disciplines. For example, say civil engineering in regards to figuring out how to best design intersections.
Yeah.
So from a more peaceful and
Yep.
person-first perspective, that's something that looking forward, if you're like, all right, so I'm going to do peace engineering as a concentration and working in this specific area.
Yeah.
So possibly like more studies or something along those lines, or contests.
Yeah. What your quote yesterday was so good. It was, we're trying to engineer peaceful. We're not engineering peace, but we're engineering peacefully. So I think in that regards, like every engineering discipline is relevant, and no matter what your technical work actually is. If it's designing intersections are a dangerous place. Vision zero, like there are so many applications. Yeah, and so I think for me, that's not what my experience was, and that was definitely reflected in this, but it can be brought into all of those engineering disciplines that are already doing some of those things. And that's, like for me, I came from a not so focused engineering background, but there are so many avenues for whether you started in construction or structural engineering, and then being able to apply that. Yeah, I think it's just every discipline has that technical knowledge. And if that is an important part of the solution as identified by the community, people who are working there, then like absolutely they can. And it's important for us to also have training that helps us better able to work with those people. And so like, not saying like, yeah, just having technical training can really improve how we interact with even other people who are working in this sphere. But yeah, no, definitely technical. Even if you do something like very niche, I think that you can do so in ways that are more peaceful, or thinking about how, one term that I really like, so I used to TA for Civic 101 here, and one thing that I always like to emphasize to my students was this idea of civic professionalism. And so really thinking about how you can be a civically engaged person and kind of creating a life that your professional and personal morals your professional interests and personal morals can align. And so we don't have to be the engineers that like sit in this black box and don't talk to other people and don't know what we're actually contributing to. And so some of it is just starting with like, what kind of engineer do we want to be? And then that can lead us to maybe do better things. So whatever organization we're working with, if we were at this talk last week where somebody was talking about, what is it, the path? Basically the path that people want to take. So when you design intersections, you design a sidewalk that goes like that. And then you see everyone just like walking like this, cutting through. And what about if we had an engineer out there who observed that and then was like, actually, we don't need this square thing. We need something, this is where people actually want to go. But it takes an engineer being out there to recognize that. It takes that engineer understanding that and being able to come back and communicating that to their boss. Their boss needs to be receptive and willing to like engage in that and really like shift how we think. So it's gonna take like a big community of people that are thinking about these things. Yeah. Yeah.
As you mentioned, there are a lot of patterns everywhere in the world. In US, Philadelphia, refugee camp, there are a lot of patterns.
Yeah.
See when there's a conflict or a situation or a disaster. But for you, going through this experience, like hands-on experience,
Yeah.
what would be the value of an international, type of work compared to engaging your own?
I think sometimes like access can be different for better or for worse, right? But there was an organization that was already doing kind of technical stuff, which provided an easy access point for me to get involved with. Whereas if you look at, I wouldn't know where to start in getting involved in Philadelphia's kind of engineering side from this peace engineering lens. I think that there are definitely ways, but just less, yeah, sometimes the path is like just kind of hard to identify. I think that people who are interested in international work should also always understand what about it that drives them, because there are issues in our own country. Immigration issues are so prevalent in the US today, and the same things that were apparent to me internationally can also be used here in the US at our own border. So I definitely think like it's just about context. So peace engineering a lot, we talk about how the context matters. So designing in one situation or the other, it's going to be different. So that would be the difference in context. But I think for me, like there are certain situations internationally which are not present in the United States, right? Like we are not involved in an active combat zone. So that would be like the big difference. But yeah, definitely like examining my own assumptions and like why I want to go internationally and making sure that I'm not having like a white savior complex of like, oh, I want to go save the world, but really understanding like where my background might be able to fit into that, and that includes at home. I think some people do it really great where, what's the lady's name at University of Texas? Talk to her.
Yvonne Santiago?
Yvonne, no. Border. Anyways, I think that there are really great people who are also acknowledging that, and so even researchers who do development work or go internationally, like should be pairing that with on the ground working with your own community. Yeah. Does that answer your question? Yeah, thanks.
So since a lot of people have been asking, I think we'll transition and start thinking about like the role of the engineer in, like, you listen to these contexts, but what does the engineer do? So Savannah will be here if you have more questions, and we'll thank her again.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, so I guess from our standpoint, so this is why we developed the program, and this is what it looks like when someone is going through it. But one thing that I'd say, it was one thing to come up with a curriculum. And I think even thinking about what you were asking, how do we evaluate engineering work within, like looking at its impacts and thinking about the potential negative consequences, that was one thing. It is a totally and entirely different thing for us to think about how to navigate research in this space. So how do we take those experiences and translate them into available, tangible steps in which engineers are useful, or maybe they're not. So how do we think about that? How do we approach problems where the engineering expertise, it's like this very small sliver in that which is going to contribute to understanding and then advancing a situation. And sometimes in situations where the engineering isn't evident to us. So how do we navigate that? How does each of us think about how to pivot engineering in that way? And so that's something that we're struggling to figure out now. And yet we're being invited to some of these different areas where we feel like we may not have, where it may not be engineering, or it may not be things that we readily see how we contribute. And so the fact that we're being asked, I think what we've come up with is that eventually stalls are going to be built, or concrete will be poured, or wires will be laid, or computer codes will be written, and we're going to be called in to do that as engineers. And so if we can do that with both technical and contextual rigor, that's a win for us. So that's what we're trying to go for. And so how to think about all of that and how to transition to that, that's kind of where we are now. And that's where we have this open invitation for everyone to think about, and for ways in which we can pivot engineering practice that way. So I think Joe and I are going to talk a little bit more about how to transition. So how do we move beyond creating our curriculum and program into building research around peace engineering? What does it look like? How does it work differently? So one example that I'll give really quickly before I hand it over to Joe is that we're partnering differently. So when Savannah comes back and says, can academics take this long-term view? Yes, but we have to do that in partnership. So one project that we're working on with Arizona State, and this was supported by Drexel through seed funding with their Center on the Future of War, it's looking at some of those impacts of conflict on civilians and the environment. So we're doing this coupled with some of the NGOs that are working on the ground. So looking at protecting civilians in conflict regions. That's what Civic does, the one on the left. PAX does that as well, but also looks at some of the environmental impacts. What does conflict do on the environment, and what are the repercussions of that? So if you used chemicals as a herbicide, what does that do long-term in the environment, and how do you look at that second-order effects? So those are the things that we're trying to do, building in partnership, so just approaching research differently. So I'm going to hand off to Joe now, who's going to talk about some of our nascent projects, the things that are growing as we see ourselves moving into new disciplines that we didn't always imagine ourselves in as engineers. You want to take this so that they can hear you? There you go.
There you go. I think hopefully that'll pick up.
Good.
Okay, I know we're running a little bit short on time, but let me introduce myself. I'm Joe Hughes, and I'm a faculty member in Civil, Architectural, and Environmental Engineering, as well as in the Peace Engineering program. Speak louder. Okay. All right, I can do. What I wanted to do today is to give you a sense of a few, as Mira said, nascent projects, things we're just getting started on, that illustrate some of the challenges that are coming to us in the Peace Engineering program, in most cases ones that we hadn't anticipated. The first I wanted to talk about is a project that, on gun violence in Pennsylvania. Gun violence in Pennsylvania is something that is on a really important scale. It's actually been declared a public health crisis in the state of Pennsylvania. And it's as a result of that crisis that our phone rang and we got involved in trying to understand how engineers can participate in an additive capacity to solutions or to attempts to reduce levels of gun violence. These are not national statistics, or these are not Pennsylvania only statistics, these are national statistics. But firearm fatalities in the United States, somewhere around 40,000 per year, of which suicides are a major component of that, but still a large percentage are either accidental deaths, mass shootings, or community violence. And it's in those domains that we've been asked to participate specifically. As an engineer, background in environmental engineering, I am not an expert in gun violence, and I didn't understand specifically what my role in this project would be, but after sitting in on the Governor's Council on this project, I started to realize that I think there were real chances for engineers to participate. Again, this is just some of the statistics, but getting down to specifically in Pennsylvania, last year we had about 1,600 fatalities because of firearm deaths. About half of those are suicide, the remaining being homicides largely. But when we start working in the area of gun violence in the state, the reason that we were brought in or asked to participate, I should say, has to do with the fact that we have a lot of different small networks that are operating in Pennsylvania on the issue of gun violence. I shouldn't say they're all small, a lot of different networks working, none of them working together. And the idea of bringing information systems together was seen as an engineering application and something that could be useful in this larger domain of organizations working on gun violence. We were supposed to be meeting with the Secretary of Health last week to formalize our engagement. The coronavirus got in the way of the health department's action on gun violence for a week or two. We'll be doing that next week, Mira and James and I. But we've already started to integrate gun violence into our peace engineering program here at Drexel. Service to the state on the governor's task force. Education, we've actually integrated gun violence as part of the project. For those of you who are taking Peace Engineering 550, you're looking at gun violence as your project in education. Now in research, we'll be working on the state's dashboard for gun violence. The dashboard itself, not so interesting from a research perspective, that's an outcome. What's going to be interesting is being able to get behind the curtain and understand the data that's being created, who's generating that data, how that data can be providing us signals that have not been observed previously or that maybe need to be amplified. So this is a nascent project. We'd really hope to announce more about that today, but the coronavirus gave us a few weeks setback, so you'll be hearing more about that in the near future. Another project that we're working on is in conjunction with Arizona State University and the Zomia Center. It has to do with the reconstruction of Fallujah. Fallujah is a city in Iraq that was the center of probably the most severe conflict during the various stages of the Iraq War, including U.S. siege in 2004 and subsequent sieges all the way up to 2017. Our initial work in this area was to try to combine work at a very granular level on the social reconstruction of the city of Fallujah, along with the physical infrastructure that engineers would be most comfortable with. We've been doing some underground surveys in Fallujah centered around, on the engineering side, power provision, electrical power provision, I should say, water, sanitation, solid waste collection, and several other factors, trying to coordinate and understand the level of services that are being provided to citizens of Fallujah and how those act as conflict motivators. I don't know how many people have been following on the conflict that's being reported in Baghdad, but that's largely around issues, for example, of insecurity of power and the desire to restore normal grid operations. But we've been working only for about 2 months in Fallujah. We've got our initial reports back now. We're just starting to synthesize those and put those in context with the sociologists who are collecting the data with us. We've taken a bit of a pivot on this project recently that puts us more in the area of public health concerns, where the major conflict motivators in Fallujah today are the after effects of the war, in particular concerns of environmental contamination. And our group working in Fallujah has asked us to specifically begin to focus on that issue. I can give more details if people are interested, but I know that we have time constraints. Where we've started, and Adam's here in the room. Adam's a student who's helping me on the GIS on this project, where we're trying to link geospatial information systems. This is a really simple example of some of the data systems that we quickly grabbed for the city of Fallujah. But being able to link issues, for example, here I'm showing waste removal as part of the mapping of the city, but to understand services and infrastructure services that we could combine with the social systems recovery of Fallujah in some sort of a information platform that's currently under development. And then the last illustrative project I wanted to give is what we're calling Lead for Peace. And this is a relatively new project. We unveiled it in about 2 weeks ago in The Hague. And the idea for Lead for Peace was is to present a framework or a scaffolding, really, of how we can consider the integration of peace engineering in an analogous way to how sustainability was incorporated into engineering, in particular through building construction processes. So how many people have been in a LEED certified building? So what does it mean? Is it a good thing? Most people say it's probably a good thing. Anyway, LEED certification was a process that began when sustainability was still a very abstract concept. There was no definitions of sustainability, but there was a belief that buildings were being constructed and operated in ways that did not promote general practices of sustainability, for example, energy efficiency. And so an organization called the Green Building Council took on, in the early 1990s, the idea of creating a ranking system for the sustainability success of a building from design through operation and actually end of life. And they created a very simple approach in that you can say, I'm in a LEED certified building and think that that's a good thing, with an extremely complex back end to the process to actually quantify specific sustainability metrics and have that become part of construction. So construction is one of the 3 largest industries in the world, and the purpose of LEED was to pivot that industry from something that was considered very non-sustainable to something that was promoting sustainability. It's actually a tremendous success story. It's now something that a mayor of a city can say, our buildings in the future will be LEED certified, and that sets construction practices. More importantly, it provides financiers a certification standard for how things have to be built. We're looking at the same process for peace. How do we integrate peaceful processes in engineering into what we do? That could be in a transportation system, that could be in a building, that could be in any type of large-scale power system, etc. Anyway, it's a new project that's gathered a lot of support. We'll be working with folks in The Hague starting in April on how to try to put this into practice through a process that's very inclusive and will begin this summer, we hope, funding available for students in August. With that, that's a really, really quick summary, but some illustrative range of projects: gun violence, reconstruction after violent conflict, and promoting standards for peaceful engineering. So, thank you.
Questions or comments on that? I think, what goes into that warehouse, so what those metrics for PR, I think that's what we need to start develop. And I think taking the approach where it's not just academics defining that, we're looking at what's done on the field and we're translating that knowledge, both technical and contextual, into our understanding of how to evaluate Lead for Peace is kind of a big area for us right now, where we welcome participation and thought, and we're going to be workshopping that really kind of around the world, in person and virtually, to gain that knowledge. So questions? Comments?
Concerns. I knew that would bring hands up.
Well, go ahead, James.
He's going to throw a softball.
The gun violence, what exactly is the project involved with it? I imagine it's trying to impair the gun violence, but like what actions are taking place? Or is it that kind of a project that you're working on that comes up with possible solutions?
Obviously, the objective is to reduce gun violence. It becomes a little bit complicated because the term gun violence actually covers a range of different behavioral elements. Suicide is one. Community violence, homicide is another. Mass shootings is a whole own phenomena. And then accidental gun violence. Each of those is characterized under that large umbrella of gun violence, and each one of those has different issues behind them. And so my focus has been primarily on the area of community gun violence, which would be homicides. And there's if we kind of push suicides away and mass shootings away and think about the phenomena, or the social phenomena behind homicides, that and how to address that, there's a lot of different schools of thought on this. One of them is very much improve law enforcement capabilities and build more jails. That's absolutely one train of thought. There's a whole other train of thought that has to do with community projects that can actually provide the support needed for individuals who rank in that level of what's called the despair index. That's a whole other approach to doing this. And then there's everything in between. Working in that sector has been really challenging because it's difficult to know where to put your thought processes. But I think what's consistent across all of those is they function much like an emergency room. They're responding to absolutely the needs of the day or the needs of yesterday, and very challenged to be able to step back and say, are there ways that we could integrate some of these practices? Are there ways that we could provide, for example, technology that would support certain practices? Or are there ways to promote better communication across these different platforms? And it's a very early entry into that. There are technologies that are being introduced, drone technologies, for example, that they recognize the sound of gunfire and immediately swarm. There are organizations that are working on those kinds of approaches to it. I think that where if I can see where peace engineering is going to go into this, is going to try to integrate more of the community context than what I just used as an illustration with drone technology. Certainly there are probably times where that's a needed technology. But right now we have an awful lot of efforts that are going on that are not coordinated, and so there's no benefit from those organizations, and just there's a communication a network issue. But I think that we're going to find there's other places that we can provide. And Savannah mentioned scaling as an issue. And this is a classic problem that we see in almost any engineering solution domain. And when we look at gun violence approaches, at least in the homicide or community gun violence, what we've seen is attempts that are successful don't scale. And scaling has not been much of a thought process behind a lot of the community organizations. And so if we can start to think about engineering process of scaling approaches, I think that's going to be one of the areas that's going to be most interesting. But it's going to be really complex because it's going to be a social scaling. It's not going to be a technology scaling.
This is kind of a classic example where we all recognize that as a social problem, but we don't see the role of the engineer readily. And so I think, we're being invited. So I think what they see is like engineers bring a mindset, a way of thinking, a way of, I think Savannah says as well, taking the complex and making it simpler, or not. But being able to do that, I think that's what people see in engineers, and I think what we see is that eventually there's going to be some sort of engineering application design something, and we're not going to do that as well if we're brought in at the end without putting as much emphasis on the contextual understanding as we do on the technical understanding.
Dr. Haas.
Joe, what I'm struggling with from everything I've heard said is, to my mind, the strength of engineering is systematic quantitative analysis as a prerequisite for design.
Mm-hmm.
And I haven't heard much that tells me, I mean, maybe the Lead for Peace gets the closest, but I haven't heard much that tells me what are these systematic analysis tools that exist that need to be developed or adapted.
You gonna take that one, Mira?
So I think the systems analysis, that's not something that comes in our there's fields of systems engineering, but it doesn't come up in our engineering education. So certainly with anything that we're putting in, there's a quantitation behind it. The design of a water system that's put in somewhere, that's still all technical engineering. It's just broadening the scope that's what's going in there. But I think in terms of what needs to advance, still need to build out. Measuring impacts, so across technical impacts, we know how to design metrics for rate of water delivery, but people impacted, goods used, so the same way in that we had to look at life cycle assessment to help us look at environmental impact, we need those same sort of quantification tools to look at social impact. And that we need to develop that. It's sort of those toolbox of how to measure impact.
And you focus on design, and I think that's really important, because design is our creative element, so informed creativity. Now, of the projects we presented here, I think there's a range of different design outcomes that are important to recognize. This is most comfortable for me because it has to do with thinking about things in a project management design context. Gun violence to me is the one that's farthest afield. For me, how do you think of engineering and design in particular affecting gun violence? And where this leads you in conflict management and conflict assessment is understanding root causes of violence, and where it is that root causes of violence form the basis for violent outcomes. And so in the cases of root conflict analysis, you're talking about the basal levels of conflict that bring one closer and closer to the basic energy of violence, the energy level of violence. When we think about addressing root causes of violence in areas like West Philadelphia, where we have very high homicide rates, we need to be thinking about subtractive processes in design. How does one reduce the level of conflict to avoid the net effect of, or the net outcome of violence? How do you reduce people's anxiety, stress, whatever, away from being close enough to violence where we see these outcomes? We don't understand that in the sociological phenomena very well.
But we have tools to do that.
We have tools.
And I guess what I don't see is what are the engineering tools that are being applied to that. The gun violence thing, for example, something like fault tree analysis or causal event analysis is entirely applicable. And is this within the portfolio?
So I think we have to get comfortable with that idea that engineering isn't always innovation. Sometimes it is adaptation, application of existing tools within the context in which they apply.
I agree with that, Mira, but I would also take it a step further, is that we have not, I do believe there are tools that are in the engineer toolkit that you've mentioned a couple of them, Chuck, that could directly apply to some of these. I think we're throwing ourselves into problems that are going to require significant innovation, not just reapplication or rethinking. I think there's going to be.
You don't know what the adaptation is needed until you try them and identify, what if anything needs to be added.
Right. So right now we're just at the stage, for example, on gun violence, where we're actually going to get to peek behind the curtain and see what information we even have and how that's been collected. And that's very primitive in terms of our ability to be able to say where different tools could be tested against that information at this stage. All I know is the gun violence rates are going up, and they're saying we could use whatever ideas people can come up with, and I think that's a place for innovation.
And part of it, I know you have something to say, part of it is logistics. I saw the water community doing this when they were trying to integrate sensor data with all types of different modeling data that were not formatted. And this is our first step in our civilian casualty project, when we're looking at the methods that everyone uses, what information they get, what's missing. And it's funny, in the way that we approached it, we took a very engineering approach. We looked at all reports of these types that we were looking first at just counting casualties. What engineers, we took an engineering approach. What organizations do, where do they look for their data, what uncertainty do they put on it. Working with an NGO partner, they use mixed methods from social sciences, so they surveyed people. Putting those together, you get information that was unavailable before, so layering those on top of each other. So at that first level, we're able to see where technical tools might come in, where other social science methods might come in, but in bringing those together, we actually unveiled different questions. So part of it is a logistics integration of how to value information taken from different fields and methods along with engineering information.
Yeah, I was just going to say that, you know, there is this concept that some in the engineering field believe that conflict or peace is just a more sophisticated system, and that we've gotten better at actually analyzing more complex systems, and therefore we should be able to find ways to engineer solutions. But I think what's been interesting about the development of this program, and specifically with respect to your question, is because so much of this is driven by socio-political aspects that we don't have access to or full engagement with, and that somebody's not bringing a problem to us and saying, can you as engineers solve this? But rather we're trying to find ways that we can actually become a part of a transdisciplinary effort. It also provides us the opportunity as engineers entering into that transdisciplinary construct to be able to bring engineers more effectively into the problem solving. So our understanding of some of the ways engineers could contribute much more to this than maybe there's an awareness of can come in a way that is not creating a fragmentation of problem solving, but rather a collaborative approach to it.
Jim, did you have your hand up?
Well, I was thinking of my field, which is buildings, and how over the last 50 years, the role of the engineer has changed as sustainability has become important, and how the design process has changed as a result of that. And it strikes me as possible that there could be an analog in the peace building world to the recognition of the engineering inputs that just haven't been understood by the rest of the community, and when they are, and value is put on them, it can actually change the design process. And it strikes me as entirely possible that, and I'm tied up in Lead for Peace, that might be a step in that direction.
Good point. Dr. Tangora.
To go back to how far we've not developed, I think in 2007 the National Academy of Engineers studied this. And right then it was clear that if we want to help engineer peace, or data analytic approaches in the social domains aren't working well, the sensing, it's not available, so that we're not actually collecting the information that we need. The systems modeling is lacking the ability to characterize humans in social situations and social societal situations, and we haven't improved on that. So just by virtue of what the National Academy said 12 years ago, we still haven't corrected those, and I still think most of the things that we're studying from probably could benefit better sensing, better modeling of people, better data analytics, and I think that's in our domain.
Agreed.
And I think that to have better modeling, you need to understand how to gain access to that data, right? And if you're not doing it peacefully, then it's likely you're not going to have access to it.
This place.
My name is Yael Branscombe. I'm new. I'm the new Senior Director of Communications and Marketing. So I'm going to ask a marketing question. Who does this appeal to? And it seems like there are many paths or backgrounds for which someone can take based on their background. So a kind of tactical question is, how do you create a program that can be so diversely taken and applied and recruited for? So I'm just trying to get background, a little more information coming into this course.
I've had a chance over the, Mira has, and I know James has too, had a chance to present this concept to a range of different audiences. And it's an interesting process, because the first reaction is usually sort of dumbfounded. There's a pause. And what are you talking about? And then people start to think for a little while, and people end up going different directions with it. But almost to a person, my interaction with this has been at the end, people go, that's a really interesting idea. Now, there's real questions about operationalizing it. I think Chuck is right on in trying to push for this. How does one operationalize this, and how does one actually define it and crystallize it? Because it's not crystal yet. I think there's different ways that one could think of it from a marketing perspective. We're an educational organization, so let's start with our students. It's not a scientific experiment, but I've got a class that's got 21 students from 6 different majors, and the majority are female. That doesn't happen. It just doesn't happen. I mean, that's an anomaly in engineering today. And what that translates to, if you say people vote with their feet, then you're saying this has broad interest, and it may be outside of the demographics of our student body. It is actually outside of the demographics of our student body. So that's one measure right there of saying this is interesting. Another set of constituents are faculty. And I don't just say faculty at Drexel, I would say faculty at universities, let's say engineering programs in the US. The list that Mary had on the screen before has been a list of people saying we ought to think about that at our university. So I'll be down in Atlanta in a couple of weeks working with the folks at Georgia Tech who are saying this is something that they think they want to implement as part of their curriculum. Now that's a faculty-driven thing. That's not students in Atlanta, that's faculty in Atlanta who are saying that. And we're hearing that from some of the other universities that you saw on the screen. And so there's that element. The program was funded by private donations, at least early on, and that was our alumni voting, and it was voting with their checkbooks. And that's not inconsequential. Our ability to work with the Peace Tech Lab was supported by private donations, and there were a lot of them. It wasn't one, it was a lot of them. Where this will resonate in other communities, I don't really know. I do think that that from an alumni basis, the idea that Drexel, it's really important to say this, Drexel is the first degree program, and you just met our first graduate. No. But let me finish. Anywhere. And we'll measure the success of this program in 15 or 20 years. It takes a long time in academia. And so that's not, but it's pretty rare for a university, and I think I can say this with some degree of data to support it, to see engineering programs adopting the first ever of its kind. It is in large part in response to what Dr. Tangora brought up, which there has been a strong push for over 20 years now to put engineering education in a more societal context. And this is an example of doing that. And there's not a lot of places that can say that they've done that. And I think that's something from a communication perspective that's really, really important. I think there's broad audiences. I think the most important ones are our students. And that to me is something that story should be told.
Yeah, we have a little student group right over here. So Maggie's she's a BSMS in the Peace Engineering program, and they're not in the Peace Engineering program, but interested in Peace Engineering as a field. And I think, because I've also been invited to give talks, I mean, like, what unfinished master's student is invited and like paid to give a talk, right? Like, that's big that people are thinking about it and wanting to interact with this kind of space. And I think the feedback that I've gotten whenever I talk to other students is like, I wish that I had that avenue. Like, there are people who are asking these questions, and it is going to be up to engineering education to provide that, or like you're going to go elsewhere as this field kind of develops and as there's more, as people know that this is kind of the avenue that you can take to engineering, right? Like, there are so few examples of doing engineering like this that are out in the public, but as they get broadcasted, people are more receptive to asking those questions and then looking for programs that are kind of doing that stuff.
I'd say we're witnessing a paradigm shift in what environmental, civil environmental, architectural engineers are interested in and are ready to show up for. That is maybe due to the internet others who care for the whole.
I hope we recorded that.
Great. Maybe you could mention also that we've gotten feedback from companies.
Yeah, the one sort of group that you missed in that was just industry, and we do hear that I think economically a lot of money is wasted on engineering projects that fail because they are not contextually adaptive or responsive. So I think from a strictly economic standpoint, I think industry sees that. But I think also within industry, billions of dollars. Kayla left, she probably has this stat. Just managing conflict within engineering firms is a huge budget drain. So just wanting to make sure no one is happy with the project that is no longer functional 5 years later, right? You want sustainability, and so I think there's now an understanding and a recognition that contextual understanding is critical to the design, and it changes the project.
So this study could be applicable in other contextual environments, to use your word. So that's interesting.
Yeah, and I think that's important to industry. They measure success not in the implementation of the project, but as long-term success.
So I'm a non-degree peace engineer, and I've spent the last 4 years since I met Mira and James exploring this around campuses around the country, and it's quite remarkable the interest there is in the student body within engineering, and it is interesting that it's that the opportunity for women in engineering to explore this and feel like this is in a direction that looks like it aligns with their values and their principles is very noticeable and exciting. I was just 2 weeks at junior out to college in central Pennsylvania, and the number of students that I had hour-long conversations with around this and the excitement they have of exploring the Drexel program. So I think that while there's going to be hesitation, this is pioneering work, and there's not necessarily a clear sense of where this can go professionally or how you're going to pay your student loans and all of those challenges. I think that from what I'm seeing from this group, they're really starting to try to tackle those aspects to give people more confidence. But also, as in my discussion with Savannah, she knows she's taking a risk. She knows that she's a part of pioneering. She knows that she's not going to necessarily be guided, that she's going to play an important role as she's demonstrating. So I think it's also important and opportunistic to present it that way, because there are students out there that will get excited about being the first wave of engineers in this field, at least informally.
Thank you.
Within the building, differentiate
I agree with everything you said, but I'm going to encourage you to make one change in how you deliver that message. Soft skills, for most of us, are very hard. Okay? And look who's standing up. Okay? Really, really hard. And I think that changing that in recognition of how difficult those soft skills are is something that's really important. So the solution for a nonlinear first-order differential equation hasn't changed in a long time, depending on boundary conditions. But you're different, and it's that human interaction that's not defined that way. That makes it really hard, right? When we start to get into the human interaction space.
Is that something this program addresses, is being able to address and communicate to bridge some of those issues? Because
Yeah, we'd all.
a lot of conflict comes from not being able to communicate.
Well, it's part of it. I think that we do a real disservice to the community at large when we say that what we do is hard and what somebody else does is soft, especially when it's wrong. Right? Ours might be hard. Engineering's not easy, but there's a lot of hard stuff out there. And I love everything you said, but I just ask you to change that one little bit going forward. And I've heard it called leadership skills. I've heard it called a few other things, but I think that's something to really think about. I think it's a difference maker in communications. So, thank you.
Thank you all for coming. I'm glad you guys flew too. I Savannah flew. Bye. Thank you guys for coming.
I kept saying